So, hey guys, I'm excited to talk to you guys about identity found in Ruth. Ruth is one of my favorite stories. She's such a courageous woman. She displays loyalty and love even when the future looks bleak, and God blesses her for these characteristics. And I highly recommend reading Ruth along as I talk or even before you listen to this Devo. It's a really short book. It's about 4 chapters and it has a lot of insight and new material. I haven't looked at it through the perspective of specifically focusing on identity, so this is very interesting for me, and I love Ruth as a character in the Bible. And so basically the basic premise of this is it's the story of a Moabite woman, Ruth, who will be the great-grandmother of King David, where the lineage of Christ comes from. So the story doesn't actually start with Ruth, but Naomi, who is from Bethlehem, and she's moving to Moab with her husband and her 2 sons to escape a famine that's going on in Bethlehem. And when they arrive, Elimelech, who is the husband of Naomi, passes away, and her 2 sons marry Orpah and Ruth. And then soon both of those sons pass away as well, and Naomi doesn't have a provider because they live in a patriarchal society, because and the men usually provide for the women. But living in Moab, Naomi doesn't have any other relatives to take care of her and her 2 new daughters-in-laws. So she decides to go back to Bethlehem, and she encourages Naomi and Orpah to remain in Moab, to go back home to their gods, to their land. And so Orpah does agree to do this because that is very convincing. It's a very secure decision. It's practical. She can go home and live with her parents and be taken care of. But Ruth, on the other hand, refuses to go back to Moab, and she wants to stay with Naomi. And she says this very sweet, convincing dialogue to Naomi in Ruth chapter 1:16. She says, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And so Ruth says this very determined, and she says it with full of love to Naomi. So Naomi doesn't argue with her anymore, and the 2 of them return to Bethlehem. And when Ruth and Naomi get to Bethlehem, it is during the barley harvest, and to help provide for Naomi and herself, Ruth decides to go glean barley in the fields. And the field that she decides to first work at belongs to Boaz, which turns out to be a relative of Elimelech. And this makes him a redeeming kinsman, which meant he had the right to redeem Elimelech's property, and at the same time to marry his widow, in order to perpetuate the name of the deceased. And so by the end of it, in more words than what I'm going to explain, Boaz does redeem Ruth and marries her. And together they have a son named Obed. And then the book ends out with the genealogy of David. But I focus mostly on chapters 1 and 2, where I think that the identity of Ruth and Naomi are the most prevalent. So Naomi's story is interesting because she is stripped of her identity. She, as a mother and as a wife, her sons and her husbands die, and she doesn't have those anymore to rely on. She doesn't have that as part of her identity, and this even happens in a foreign land, so she doesn't have a familiarity of being a native in this land that her husband and her sons have passed away in. So this loss of her sons and her husbands makes Naomi question the Lord and ask if she deserves such a punishment. And we've probably experienced or will experience pain and loss. And so if you're reading along, you should try to look at different things that symbolize security as well as loss, and think about what symbolizes security and loss in your own lives, and how this affects your outlook. So since Naomi feels that the Lord has made her empty, she changes her identity in a pretty apparent way. She changes her name when she gets to Bethlehem. She changes it from Naomi, meaning pleasant, to Mara, which means bitter, because this is a very bitter time in her life. It's a very difficult, and she feels hurt and alone and like she's forgotten, like as if God is punishing her. And she allows her hurt to cloud her sight. And she feels broken and alone, but she isn't. God is providing for her through Ruth, who is gleaning barley in the fields and provides for Naomi. And God doesn't abandon Naomi. He's there in her suffering, but he also uses her in a very interesting way to bring Ruth to him, because Ruth didn't know Christ, probably didn't know Christ. It doesn't say specifically, but it does say in verse 15 of chapter 1 that when Naomi's telling Ruth and Orpah to go back home, she also said, go back to your gods, return to your sister-in-law. Return after your sister-in-law, which says that the Moabs did not have the same gods as God, the creator, that the Israelites believed in. And so in this way, that even in Naomi's brokenness, her identity wasn't found on earth, but was found in God, who comforts and provides and uses people to further his kingdom and his work. So, but like Naomi, how has a disaster, loss, or injustice made you question your identity in God? Or have you seen someone question their faith, and how has that affected them or you? After Naomi questions her faith, what do you think she did? Because like I said earlier, just briefly, Obed was born, and he would be the one to carry on the lineage of Christ and of Ruth, and to take care of these women who were widowed. So I'm going to talk about Ruth next. So Ruth's story, on the other hand, is very interesting because she's a Moabite, a Gentile who worshipped other gods than the Israelites, and her original identity isn't even found in God that we know of. So she doesn't know him yet, but her identity is born again when she chooses to go with Naomi instead of remain in Moab. Sorry. And she tells Naomi, your God will be my God, and she becomes part of God's people and part of that community. And she incorporates this new identity as part of being a God believer in God into her own identity. And so I think this is really good to think about where your own faith has come from. Like Ruth's faith came from Naomi. Reflect on the faith of someone else that you trust, and think about their faith and how it's affected your own. So Ruth, finding this belonging in her new home and prizing a relationship with God over the security of returning home, also reminds us to think about what are things that make us secure, what makes you feel secure, and what would happen if those securities were taken away. What would you depend on then? Because Naomi depended on her husband and her sons to take care of her, and when that wasn't an option anymore, she just put one foot in front of the other and returned home with Ruth, hoping to be provided for in some way. And we often have difficulty with this because we always want to choose the safe and practical option rather than the option that God puts out before us, because that's often uncomfortable and more risky. And just as we have to choose our faith, and just as Ruth chose her faith, despite the risk, we also have to choose our faith, because one day this is going to become our own conviction, whether or not we were raised in a faith-based home or a non-faith-based home. Like Ruth, who chooses to follow Naomi and start a new relationship with God, and act righteously and by her mother-in-law. We also have this option to choose Christ as our full-on identity. So it's very interesting to read about Ruth and Naomi with these different ideas about their identities and how they allowed them to affect their actions throughout this book, and how God uses their identities. Ruth, a Gentile who wouldn't normally be even accepted into worship with them, to be part of the lineage of Christ, and how God uses Ruth and this as part of her identity to show that the lineage of Christ isn't full of perfect people, but of the people that you'd almost least expect. And it also shows that you can struggle and question your faith like Naomi does, and God will still be with you in your suffering. Even when you're struggling to remain strong in your identity, even when you name yourself bitterness, that God is with you, and he does provide for you in ways that you may not even notice. So even if you're feeling alone, like Naomi did, and if you've had a lot of loss and grief, God is still there in that suffering, providing for you in ways that you may not even recognize yet, or it hasn't happened yet, but he's there with you no matter what. And so in these women, you can see how strong they are, and how God uses them to further his kingdom and relate this message over time that he's there with us in our suffering, and how our identity isn't tied up in like labels we give ourselves, but in how our relationship with him looks. So I hope that y'all caught on to some of the questions I was asking throughout this Devo, and I'll ask Jenny to send out the questions themselves, and so you can look at them. You don't have to dwell on all of them, but I would encourage you to take one or two of them and really think about them, and how your identity has changed or will change, and how it has been affected by these different factors in your life. So if you have any questions, my phone number is 512-588-0718, and you can either just text me or we can FaceTime. I'm good with either. I'd love to go over this and study more with you. If I don't know the answer, we can figure it out together. It's a really good book. I love it. So good. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.